My name's Meredith Lilly. I'm an associate professor here at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. My research looks primarily at, well, with respect to migration, looks at Canada-U.S. relations and high-skilled immigration. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce Dr. Laurie Trautman, who is director of the Border Policy Research Institute at Western Washington University, where she spends a lot of time thinking about the Canada-U.S. border. So we look forward to hearing more about her work. And she's also a global fellow with the Woodrow Wilson Center. And I'm particularly happy to learn that she's recently also joined us at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute as a fellow. And so she also has an immediate Ottawa connection. Anyway, welcome.
Okay, so my presentation today is not actually about the research I do. It's more about how we could integrate border studies and border policy. And it's based really on my perspective and my experience as somebody who operates both in academic circles and in the policy sphere. So when I'm at a meeting with government or industry, I tend to be one of the few academics in the room. And then when I'm at an academic conference, I'm kind of an anomaly because I'm not in that tenure track world. I'm not in the publishing world. I'm writing 2 to 4 page policy briefs and trying to run an institute. So when Victor asked me to come here to talk about this topic, I was really happy because it's central to the work that I do, and it's also the very reason why my institute exists. And that institute, the Border Policy Research Institute, is actually the only institute of its kind in the United States, in that we are an academically based and fully funded research institute whose sole purpose is to study the US-Canada border from a policy perspective. And every time I say that, I think, is that really true? There's really no other comparable institute, but it's true. And I use that example to highlight that we're sort of the exception that proves the rule, and the rule being that studying and understanding that Canada-US border relationship is incredibly undersupported in the United States. And I would argue it's pretty undersupported in Canada as well. So my presentation today is going to highlight what I see as both the barriers and the opportunities to better integrate border studies with border policy. And I want to make clear that my remarks are really focused on the US-Canada border relationship, not the European situation or other situations around the world. But I do think that there's global relevance for the work that we're doing here. So, looking at border studies and border policy, I'm going to start my talk off by just giving a brief snapshot of the current landscape of what I see as the US-Canadian border policy kind of lay of the land right now, and then a little bit about what border studies looks like related to the Canadian border. But I wanted to also highlight before I go into that the policy world is really complex. We often tend to think about influencing policy as sort of talking to policymakers, but policymakers really come and go, and policy making itself is about governance that exists at really multiple scales. And the border itself really kind of embodies those multiple scales because, as we know, borders are not homogeneous. Borders are different depending on where you go. And so they tend to operate both sort of from a federal policy standpoint, but also individually. So it's important to remember the sort of complexities that come around border policy specifically. So looking at the Canada-US border relationship, I think personally we have a very collaborative and innovative policy relationship. When we talk about how we conceptualize borders and these ideas of deterritorializing and reterritorializing, the Canada-US relationship is a fascinating example of how these things are kind of reworked through policy. And I'm just going to highlight a few examples of what I think are pretty innovative policies on the Canada-US border. The first, of course, is NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Program, which existed since the 1950s. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it was prompted basically by a 1950s threat or fear of Russian intercontinental ballistic missiles entering U.S. airspace. Well, before they would enter U.S. airspace, they would enter Canadian airspace. So the U.S. and Canada came together and formed sort of a shield or a perimeter around that North American aerospace area. And that's a very coordinated program, to the point that on the morning of the September 11th attacks, it was actually a Canadian official who happened to be operating the program that morning, and it was a Canadian official who responded. And a lot of people don't realize that level of trust and integration between the US and Canada from a security standpoint. We also have a program called ShipRider, which is quite innovative. That's a program where Canadian RCMP and U.S. Coast Guard ride around in the same boat, and they can cross the border back and forth and enforce either U.S. or Canadian law, depending on what side of the border they are on. And then preclearance is a program that I'm going to talk about a little bit later, but many of you have probably experienced this in airports where you've been bound for the U.S. and you've actually pre-cleared U.S. Customs and Immigration before you even enter the airplane, and then you land on U.S. soil and you're free to go. Well, this is really a pretty innovative program because you have U.S. Customs and Border Protection officials essentially enforcing U.S. law on foreign soil. And this program, which has existed in the air mode for decades, has just a couple months ago officially been expanded to the marine, rail, and land modes. So a big deal for our U.S.-Canadian border relationship. Certainly we can't talk about the U.S.-Canada border without highlighting the impact of 9/11 that reconfigured our border forever. I don't think we'll ever get back to that pre-9/11 era. And it did create a little bit of stagnation on the Canadian-U.S. border because the U.S. became so preoccupied with security that we sort of weren't paying attention to the efficiencies that were lost at the border. But I would say we fairly quickly came back from that, at least from a policy standpoint. We had the Security Prosperity Partnership in 2003, and of course the Beyond the Border Accord in 2011, which was our most recent policy framework that some would argue accomplished more things than others, but regardless, we had a strong policy framework that guided a lot of the policy efforts that trickle down throughout various levels of government in both Canada and the United States. But right now, we have nothing. So Trump came in, Trudeau came in, and they both sort of threw the baby out with the bathwater, and there is no policy framework at all to guide the U.S.-Canada border relationship. And this is a big deal when you're talking about federal agencies because we don't have that sort of policy guidance. We don't have that mandate that can be used for funding, particularly in the transportation world. Obviously, security is still an ongoing, has some ongoing momentum, but I would say it's impacted us a lot. Interestingly, though, in that absence of a strong policy framework and a strong government role, we're seeing an increasing role of non-government stakeholders in that U.S.-Canada border policy relationship. And I'll come back to that, but I think that is an opportunity for border studies to become more involved in policy moving forward. So looking just briefly at Canada-U.S. border studies, I'm not going to go up here and talk about all the research that's being done. I think there's a lot of great research being done. I'm going to focus more on the structure of what that research looks like. So certainly we have a variety of university programs and institutes in both countries, but I would say that these tend to be really dependent on individual scholars or grant projects. We have much less of an integrated border research sort of consortium or a framework that I would argue is really needed for long-term connections with policymakers. We have some great one-off collaborations. The Borders and Globalization Project was an example of that. It knitted together a lot of scholars with each other. It brought in some policymakers. That program, maybe after this conference itself, is sort of ended, and it remains to be seen how much will move forward from that, but the funding will be gone. So there's a lack of longevity, and as I mentioned before, I think border scholars connect with each other great. The Association for Borderland Studies is a great example of that, but they connect less with policymakers. And Randy kind of touched on this earlier in the morning. Some of what we deal with, especially in the United States, is severe American apathy towards Canada. And I say this as somebody that runs a research institute at a university that's 30 kilometers south of the Canadian border, and we have students in our university who couldn't name the 3 countries that were in NAFTA. Now, you ask them about cannabis legislation, and they all know that Canada was legalizing federally, so take it with a grain of salt. But there is a lot of antipathy, and that trickles down into the world of border studies. And preparing for this conference, I had one of my research assistants. I said, we just go out and quickly look at some of the publications that are done in the U.S. that are focused on the Mexican border and the ones that are focused on the Canadian border, so that I can get a sense quantitatively of how much more we're focused on the Mexican border. And this is what she came up with. So the red line is, and this is rough, but the red line is basically publications looking at U.S.-Mexican border, and then the yellow one is publications looking at the U.S.-Canada border. And they're incredibly low. They're in the 20s each year. So we're not starting from a huge, robust platform, but we are starting from, I would say, again, there's an innovative policy relationship, and there is space for those of us who do this work to insert ourselves into that policymaking process. So, as I mentioned, I'm not going to sort of go into the nature of the work that we do, but I want to highlight how we can communicate the research we're doing to a policy audience better by looking at some of these connections and barriers. But first, I want to make the case for the importance of border studies to policy. And I'm mainly talking about border policy, but when I talk about border policy, it's not just about what's happening at the border, it's about that relationship too, right, between the US and Canada. So, of course, as border scholars, we have a lot of academic freedom that especially the government does not have. We can ask questions that the government may want answers to, but they can't actually ask them those questions themselves. We have a really unique ability to inform and ground public policy, whether you're a geographer or from another discipline. We perform case study research, we perform on-the-ground interviews, and that can really ground some of these higher-level conversations. And I also think we have the ability to educate the public and improve awareness of the impact of border policy. There's been a lot of talk about perceptions and misunderstandings and the media and how the media is used. And as academics, we can play a role in better communicating these issues. And we can also serve as a credible, and I put neutral in there in bold because I think academics tend to be seen as a little more neutral than government and private sector, and provide a well-informed perspective. And there's really a critical need right now for better policy analysis. I hear this from government all the time. We need good policy analysis, but we're not getting it. And this is partly due because there is an increasingly complex world of borders. What I see from the US-Canadian relationship is we really are on the cusp of an entirely new way of operating our borders, and that's going to go to artificial intelligence and facial recognition. And US CBP is already out there giving presentations on exactly what this is going to look like and how the technology is ready to go. I was just at the Vancouver airport yesterday, and there was a big sign on the wall that said, Canada's border is going digital. Click here to learn more about it. And that's coming. And with that is going to come a whole new array of complex issues that border studies should be at the forefront of explaining. So I want to give you a real world kind of example of a role that border studies and border scholars could play. So this is the Prince Rupert Terminal, way up in northern British Columbia. Has anybody ever been there? A lot of people have been there. An amazing place. For those of you who don't know, it's the shortest nautical distance between mainland China and North America. It's one of the most natural deep water ports in the world. And it is also connected to the rest of Canada and to the US Midwest by a very good, strong rail network. So lots of shipping is coming through this area. And some years ago, there was a pilot project that was testing the ability for US CBP to conduct pre-clearance up in Prince Rupert. And the idea was they'd get an advanced manifest from these ships coming over from China. They would sort of pre-clear them, pre-screen them when they hit the border in Prince Rupert. They'd get loaded onto trains, and those trains would go all the way down to International Falls, Minnesota. It wouldn't have to stop again. So it would be that inspected once, cleared twice model. Well, depending on who you ask, this pilot was either a complete success or it was an utter failure. So government sees this pilot project as a success because it proved the fact that US CBP and CBSA could communicate very clearly together. They could share this information. They could screen this stuff coming in from China. If you ask the private sector, a couple of people who are here from there today, they say it's an utter failure because from a shipping perspective, these trains didn't stop or they weren't cleared twice. They ended up stopping at the US border, and there's a variety of reasons for that. A lot of it comes down to agricultural inspections that had to be conducted. But essentially, the goods that were shipping got held up and they got disrupted. So private sector was not very happy with how this pilot project went. So I think that this sort of example is a place where border studies could provide a critical policy analysis, because you had this project, you had outcomes sort of interpreted in different ways, but there was no neutral entity that came in and said, I'm going to do a thorough analysis of what actually happened here and write up a report that's not coming from industry, focusing on efficiency, and it's not coming from government that's just sort of focusing on security. And I think it's also important to remember when we talk about policy and bureaucracy that people in government and private sector as well have very specific roles that they play, and there's often a disconnection between those that are at the policymaking level and those that are on the ground. And I certainly see that all the time working with the Department of Homeland Security, which is a behemoth organization. And it surprises me when I'll talk to like the local port director between BC and Washington, and I'll talk to somebody at headquarters in DC, and they actually are not aware of sort of the different conversations that are going on, even though we're all talking about basically the same thing. So lots of need for these more comprehensive and more neutral analyses to happen. So how can we, as border studies scholars, better connect to the policymaking world? So I'm just going to sort of list a few things that I see that I think are opportunities. Think tanks are certainly a great way for border scholars to connect to not just the public, but also government. I was recently at a conference where I had a little sidebar meeting, and I brought in some private sector people and some government people, and I said, how can we better connect to policy? And there was somebody there from the Canada West Foundation. He stood up and he said, well, in my think tank, we only answer the research questions that are being asked of us. So we know everything we're producing has an outlet and has somebody who needs that information. And those think tanks, not only do they have good connections with government, but they also have very strong media platforms. So communicating through those think tanks is a great opportunity for border studies to get better engaged. It's also, I think, really important to connect. Remember, we need to connect with multiple scales of government. So we're not just talking about the federal scale, there's regional, provincial, state, and local again. And creating those vertical linkages, as I mentioned, we could have a federal government official and then a more regional or provincial government official. And we think that they talk to each other because they might both be looking at border transportation, but that's not necessarily true. And so as academics and border studies, I think we could create those vertical linkages to make those conversations stronger. And this is particularly true with border policy because border policy is a federal jurisdiction, but has a very huge local impact. And again, the border's not homogeneous. So one port may be operated differently from another port, even though we all have to operate under the constraints of that federal policy. It's also important to remember that we need to be connecting across sectors. So it's not just government. We should be talking to practitioners, those people on the ground who actually have the experience knowing what's working, what's not working, what sort of issues there might be associated with certain policies that those policymakers have no idea about. Businesses and academics and nonprofits, like there's the whole sort of horizontal linkages as well that's important to remember. This thing is sticky. Okay. And again, I made this point earlier, but elected officials come and go. So the policymakers themselves are actually much more embedded into that level of interaction with practitioners and agency bureaucrats. So what are the ongoing barriers? I think a lot of these are going to be obvious to those of us in the room, but I think it's still worthwhile highlighting them. Financial constraints. As academics and border scholars, we don't necessarily have money to go to some of these conferences that have, $800,000, $900,000 registration fees. I know at my university, which is a fairly small university, professors tend to pick the one or two academic conferences that they go to, and it's pretty hard to branch outside of that. I think the model of tenure publishing and to a certain extent disciplinary silos is incredibly limiting. I could go into that forever, but I won't go down that road. How we disseminate information is also very problematic from a policy-making standpoint. Border scholars are engaged in peer-reviewed journals and books and academic conferences, and that's sort of its own little world. And I don't think that world gets translated very effectively into the arena of public policy. I'm not saying it never does, but from a systematic standpoint, it's not an effective way of communicating certainly with industry, but also with government. And I won't get into this too much, but I do think there's a pretty big tension between oversimplification and complexity. As border scholars, we're doing a lot of theoretical work, a lot of conceptual work that's really important, but communicating that, again, can be really challenging to the average person or to a government official. So I think the most important point I wanted to make in terms of the barriers that I see between border studies and border policy is the need for a really clear, concise, and timely mechanism of communication. And this is a challenge probably for any field, but for something as complex as borders, I think it's a really important thing to recognize. And I was had a conference last spring with somebody who said to me, he said, I love the work that you academics do. It's so interesting, but I'm not going to read your 30-page report because I have 5 minutes with the congresswoman tomorrow, or I'm going to tweet about something. And he said to me, what I want is bullet points. Can you give me bullet points? And I'm thinking, how many academics do I know who could take that huge, like Lupita's 10-year research project and distill it into bullet points? So that's a really hard thing to do. But that's what's being asked of us. So, sort of to move to the final section, since this is talking about new directions for border studies, the question I wanted to pose in my presentation was, how can border studies address questions that are critical to society and inform public policy in an effective and meaningful way? This is a big question. This isn't something I'm going to try and answer today. But I do think that border studies has been really effective in analyzing the impacts of border policies, but we need more intentional and structured efforts if border scholars seek to contribute to actual policy-making processes. So again, I think there's some really interesting emerging opportunities for border studies to become better engaged and connected to border policy specifically, and I'm going to talk about those in a minute. But this will require new ways of communicating and forging stronger, more dynamic relationships across industries and at different scales. No small feat, but. So some new directions to sort of sum this stuff up. We need stronger collaborations and relationships. We need to develop structural connections with non-academics to address some timely policy questions, whether that's through think tanks, that's through a research consortium, but something that has more longevity than an individual scholar or an individual grant project. More important than anything, we need more dynamic ways of communicating. People aren't reading books, they're not reading. Even I was interviewed recently by The Economist, and I thought, oh, this is so great, The Economist, right? So the article came out, and I couldn't find it anywhere. My local library didn't carry The Economist. My local bookstores didn't carry The Economist. So like some of that really good journalism and really good media is getting harder and harder for people to get because like my university isn't even subscribed to it anymore. So figuring out how to really, dial into ways that people can hear what we're saying. And again, coming back to the idea that some sort of institutional framework, I think the European situation is probably quite different than what we have in the US-Canadian situation. But we don't have, right now I do think we're dependent on individual scholars in these kind of one-off grant processes. We don't have those strong government institutions, which maybe are problematic in and of themselves. I don't know. Decent government funding for grant projects, but not so much for an institutional framework. So sort of to sum things up, I have just one or two more slides. There is a very interesting evolving policy landscape right now in the US-Canadian context. And I sort of touched on this earlier, how we have this policy void right now at the federal level, and that creates a lot of challenges, a lot of frustrations, but I think it also creates a lot of opportunities, especially for those non-government stakeholders to be part of those conversations. So I'm just going to give you two examples of some of the projects that I've been involved in that I think are kind of interesting and innovative ways that are driving US-Canadian border policy. So the first is something called the Cascadia Innovation Corridor. If you're not from the British Columbia, Washington region, you probably haven't heard of this, but it is a program that it's very regional, very focused on BC, Washington, and Oregon. And it's really a bottom-up effort that has been initiated by Microsoft Corporation, which is based in Seattle. So it's private sector initiative, but we have support at various levels of the state and province, including the governor of Washington and the premier of BC. And this effort in particular is really focused on the innovation economy, but it has a very strong border element because it's trying to strengthen the ties between the innovation economy in Vancouver and Seattle. So of course you have that border there in the middle. Another interesting example that I find really, really fascinating is something called the Beyond Preclearance Initiative. This is actually more of a federal top-down approach to trying to drive sort of the next beyond the border framework, because we have nothing like that right now. And this is industry-led. So in the past, we've seen a lot of border efforts that were government-led and there was industry partners. But this is actually industry coming to the table and saying, we have some funding, we have this very strong coalition, we'll bring in some government partners, but what we're going to do is we're going to develop what we see as the next border policy framework for the Canada-US relationship. And so this is a pretty big effort. One small part that I've sort of been involved with is developing what I've been talking about, this research consortium along the Canadian-US border that would actually tie together academia and government and industry. So again, I think these are kind of maybe not novel approaches to border management. We've seen things like this in the past, but I think they're good opportunities for those of us in the academic sector and those of us who do border studies to be a part of driving these policy trends. Now, I feel like I should end on an optimistic note, but I'm kind of a realist, so I can't quite bring myself to do that. So I'm going to end with a quote. I was recently at the North American Strategy for Competitiveness Conference, and a lot of what we've been looking at lately has been NAFTA and the challenges of talking about free trade in the current populist environment and the politics. And there was a speaker who said something that really struck me that I thought not only applies to the challenges of communicating free trade, but also applies to the challenges of communicating the border to the public. And he said, "We're trying to counter with complexity something that's presented with simplicity." And I think, border issues particularly are presented by the media in very simplistic ways, and this is a really big problem for border studies. Immigration, sovereignty, and borders themselves are often kind of distilled into these dichotomous narratives that are centered on conflict. They seem to want to be centered on conflict. And that drives public perception. And in the United States and Canada as well, public perception drives policy. So we find ourselves in this situation where we're not being very productive in terms of how we're communicating the border and how that's driving border policy. So I do think border studies has a really critical role to play in better informing that public perception and better informing the conversations that we have about borders, at least in the Canadian-US context, but I think globally as well. And that's all I have.
We'll take some questions. Maybe I'll take Chair's prerogative and ask the first one. So I wonder, from your perspective, who you think should be setting the... Oh. Bad chair. Okay. Who should be setting the agenda in the discussions between researchers and policymakers in this field? And I ask that because sometimes I find I watch the sort of security and defense space a little bit. I don't do any work in that area, but I've noticed that at times there's a subset of academics that appear to be much more on sort of the same page as the policymakers in that environment. And at times I think I see that those who do border research are really almost speaking a totally different language than what I see policymakers talking about. And so should this be a collaboration, or who should be moving to whose sort of sphere of understanding language, that kind of thing?
Well, I definitely think it should be a collaboration. And I also think that, there's always going to be scholars that have absolutely no interest in informing policy. They're developing theoretical approaches, they're doing other sort of things. And then there's other people, there's a few of us in the room that are just more sort of oriented towards that policy world. So I think there's a natural connection there. But the language piece is huge. And I get sort of back to that I want bullet points thing. Well, you've got policymakers that want one thing. So we do these policy briefs and we never make them more than 6 pages because we know if they ever get to be more than 6 pages, they're not going to get read. So there has to be sort of a meeting in the middle, right, between the ways we've traditionally done things.
So we talked about this briefly, but now that I've listened to your talk, I'd love to hear what you would say about Alan Kurdi.
I don't know who that is.
The child who was photographed on the beach, the dead child who was photographed on the beach, because in that single photo, policy shifted after having been discussed on every side for years. Policy shifted almost overnight. So we talk a lot about trying to bridge the gap between academia and policy in the government level, and yet one photograph that is transmitted worldwide all of a sudden brings everybody to the table. So are there other platforms that you've seen or that you might imagine, photography, I'm going to ask you about art, that might bridge the gap in ways that are maybe more effective than some of the channels that we've been seeing?
That's a really great question. And I hate to think about driving policy in a sort of sensational way, because I don't think that's how we want to drive our policy. I think we have to be very thoughtful and very holistic and comprehensive. I can't really speak to art in that capacity, unfortunately. I just haven't had enough exposure to that. But I think sort of maybe what you're getting at is the importance of driving people's emotions and connecting with them on a personal level, and how important that can be to policymakers. And so I guess I would just say I think you're absolutely right, but I would hope that we could do it in a more thoughtful and comprehensive way so it doesn't come down to pictures like that driving policy, but much more forethought put into it.
So thank you. That was great. I really enjoyed listening to that. I'm wondering if you could say something about how you develop institutional trust. So I think quite reasonably government institutions look with some suspicion on academics because our inherent nature is to be critical. And if you're an agency, that might give you pause. So I'm just wondering how you go about the conversation to say, we will be neutral, we will be fair, we will hope to generate things that are useful to you. And what you do when you run up against the answer, which is, why should we trust you? Why should we engage with you given your nature is probably to be critical?
Yeah, another great question. And this is particularly a sensitive issue when you're dealing with CBSA and CBP, because it takes a long time to build up those relationships with those security agencies, particularly at the port level. I think that at the higher up level, professionals are sort of trained to engage in those conversations, but when you're talking to practitioners, especially US CBP, who's constantly under the gun and under fire, it's hard, and it just takes time, and it just takes continual cultivation of those relationships. I guess I would say from my institute's perspective, we've always put out policy analyses that were what's ever objective, but as objective as they could be, and fairly neutral. And we've been very careful not to be critical. So, from a border studies standpoint, that might be a criticism of the work that I would do, is it's maybe not as critical as it could be. But that's how we've built up trust. And we've sort of delivered analyses with some policy recommendations, but without too much advocacy either. So it's a fine line. And I think that it sort of a little bit comes back to Meredith's question about how do you come to the table. Well, there's a give and take on both sides, and some of that has to be trust, and some of that might have to be, you can be critical in your peer-reviewed book or your peer-reviewed journal article, because government's probably not going to read that. But if you're doing a policy brief or you're giving a presentation, you have to maintain that trust, you probably have to read your audience, I think.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that presentation. And I am with the CBSA and a manager responsible for setting up research capacity at the CBSA to support policy development. And I found, a lot of the points you made really critical about building trust and working collaboratively. All of the work that we do in government, as you are aware, there is a responsibility to have it evidence-based. And so we really do need to work together to make sure that we provide the best information that we can to inform policy development. And I think there are opportunities maybe to maybe more directly work together. For us, I know that there are issues around, cost-benefit analysis that are really critical. How do we demonstrate the value of the work that is done? Trend analysis, comparative analysis. How is Canada doing compared to other countries? So really looking at the kinds of studies that can really inform policy. I don't like to think that policy doesn't look at more than 6 pages, because I spent 20 years in policy, and I did read a lot more. But at the end of the day, it does have to be something that can be communicated easily. And I think there is a give and take, and there is a lot of interest working with academia. And certainly I'm exploring what opportunities there are for us, and I really hope that there are lots more opportunities such as this one, and then more concrete ways to collaborate. So I look forward to that. Thank you.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, but it gets back to the question of trust. And there's a lot of data that CBP and CBSA have that we can't do studies on unless we have that data, but you have to have that trust to get that data. And even then, sometimes it's not possible. But that's the first step in order to even be able to engage in those studies.
It's just a very specific question. When I looked at the graph that you put up about publications between US and Mexico and US and Canada, there was a real divergence, I think, around 2005. Was there any, do you have any insight into what drove that divergence? There we are.
Yeah, I looked briefly at this, and I was trying to think, like, it's not an immediate post 9/11. I mean, I don't know what happened before 2006 that would have, maybe you have better.
I think the Canadian uptick is post 9/11 research, finally seeing the light of day.
And then just dropping off after that, because that had been studied. Yeah, that makes sense. This was peer-reviewed publications, sort of like a journal database, and a quick search of some specific parameters. US-based, in English. So it takes a long time to get a peer-reviewed publication. But yeah, like I said, this is a little rough and dirty. It's not like a super comprehensive, but it gives us an idea of the relative difference between the two.
To give us another concrete example of how all of this can be achieved, perhaps you could just speak a little bit about the organization right in your area in Bellingham. That what's the acronym for it?
IMTC.
IMTC, exactly. IMTC is a collaborative cross-border organization that isn't based on any model or any collaborative government-based relationship or agreement. Maybe you can just give us a sense as to why it works, how it works.
Yeah, and I would say too, the cross-border collaboration in the U.S.-Canada context is very regional. Very regional, and in the BC, Washington, or Cascadia, or Pacific Northwest, whatever you want to call it, in that region we have an incredibly robust set of institutions that engages in cross-border collaboration. So there's my institute, there's the Pacific Northwest Economic Region, which is broader than just BC, Washington. Somebody alluded to it earlier in their presentation, it was Randy. And then there's this group called the International Mobility and Trade Corridor Program that's a little bit obscure, not very well known. It's not very sexy. It's basically the transportation organizations in BC and Washington and the security agencies, CBP and CBSA, and some local government. I'm the only academic involved, and then one of our local planners from the Council of Governments runs that. And basically, we get together every single month for 3 hours, and we talk about what's happening at the border. And sometimes it's really boring stuff, like the pedestrian crossing needs another brick, and we can't get the brick put in because they don't know whose jurisdiction it is. And then sometimes it's really important things, like we're thinking about reconfiguring our entire fast lane, but we don't really know how to go about studying the efficacy of that. So we get together and we talk about these things, and then my role, along with the planner, is to come together and say, all right, looks like we need to do a research project on this topic. Maybe it's reconfiguring the fast lane. So we go out and we find a bunch of funding, and it's almost always binational funding that comes either provincially, state, or federal as well. and we carry out these research projects. So one we did recently was stopping about 10,000 people as they cross the border between BC and Washington and asking them why they're crossing the border and where they're going and where they started and how often they cross and why don't they have Nexus cards. So all of that information, we use it, our local government uses it, the transportation planners use it, and then the security agencies themselves use it because, for example, they want to know why don't more people have Nexus cards. Well, from that study, we know in our region there's a good 20% of people who don't even know about the program. They've sort of heard about it, but it seems really confusing to them, or the application process is too long. So in that way, again, we're sort of answering these questions that are asked, that need to be asked, that CBP doesn't have research funding to carry out these projects, to have students up there at the border collecting data. So it's a really good relationship, and it's one with a lot of trust involved because they let us bring students at the border, stop cars as they're crossing. So it's very effective in that way because it's ongoing, it's structured, and again, it's answering research questions that are directly being asked.
To what extent do academics, now I've participated in working with that group and managed to get some very, very important information and data that could be used for things I was doing. To what extent are other scholars getting involved?
None.
Maybe that's something we should work on.
But again, it's very regional. So for example, somebody at UBC might be interested in getting involved in that. But yeah, it's kind of under the radar because it's this world of transportation and security and sort of a mundane topic, I would
We'll
say.
take one last question from Randy, and then it's time for us to move to the next session.
Well, just to pick up on this points though to the fact that your particular region stands out.
Yeah.
By far the most integrated region in terms of collaborative research, but you go across the continent, you don't find that at all.
Right.
I mean, there's very little that goes on, particularly where I used to live in the prairies and plains. There's really nothing going on. So there's the danger of you may come up with ideas and strategies and plans, but they're geographically
Yes.
specific
You're right.
to that region. So that's a problem.
That's a problem, but I also think that it can be an opportunity for other regions to see what's happening there. And on that note, I would just wanted to add to this Cascadia Innovation Corridor concept, which is driven by our former governor, who used to say very publicly that Washington State has more in common with our BC neighbors than any other state in the country. And I thought that was a pretty bold political statement from an elected official, but she didn't get pushback from that because it's really recognized in Washington residents that our neighbors to the north are way more similar to us than, say, California or other parts of the U.S. So there's kind of this embedded culture of collaboration that it's just sort of taken for granted that it makes sense for us to collaborate. There's no territorial issues like you get in New York or Detroit. So yeah, it's geographically specific, but I would like to think that setting a sort of a high standard is a good thing to do.
Great. Well, thanks so much. Let's all
Thanks,
extend our
Meredith.
appreciation and move on to the next session.